right after Tzeil Mad, we're starting to go through the first verse from the passage in Deuteronomy, as we said, where the farmer comes up and delivers his first fruits to the Kohen. And we read, Aramei Oved Aviv, Vayered Mitzrayma, Vayagar Sham, Bimsei Ma'at. And Aramean wanted to destroy my father. I told you about the Netziv. And he went down to Egypt because there he could survive. And he was there as a sojourner, not as a full resident. And here the Haggadah quotes the verse from Breshis, when the brothers came down to Egypt and they appeared before Pharaoh, they said, roughly, but not exactly what Joseph told them to say, we have come to sojourn in the land, not to stay, not to become full citizens, for there's no pasture for the flocks that belong to your servants. We are shepherds, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. Now please let your servants dwell in the land of Goshen. As I told you, this was Joseph's plan to set up a ghetto, only the Goshen, and to identify themselves as shepherds, which to the Egyptians was something which they were far from, because the shepherds would eat the animals which are to them sacred animals. This should set up a barrier. Then it says they came down bimsei ma'at, with a few, and he quotes the verse that your fathers went down to Egypt with 70 persons, and now Hashem, your God, has made you numerous as the stars in heaven. So first of all, 70 isn't exact because these are the descendants of Jacob, but some of them were married. Some of them had women who, according to some opinions, came from other places. It was more than 70. Now, I just want to mention to you, because people, sort of roll their eyeballs at this. How many Jews left Egypt? Well, the Torah tells us 600,000 men over the age of 20. Roughly 600,000 women of the same age, it's 1,200,000. And then children, lots of children. Let's say a nice round number of 2.5 million or 3 million. It was an expanding population after all. Can you get from 70 to 3 million in 210 years? Can you really do that? Must not each woman have had 60 children, 100 children? I said, oh, but I remember a midrash that says they used to give birth to 6 at a time. Okay. Maybe that helps. But if you do a little calculation, you will discover that if you start with 70 and you take 210 years as 7 generations, now I'm making assumptions. I tried to check with population statistics, couldn't find whether these assumptions are realistic or not. But they're approximate, and you'll see that they conquer the problem in grand fashion. Let's say you have 7 generations. So, and let's suppose that you have each person in each generation leaves over 5.5 descendants. 5.5. And you have 7 generations. If you multiply it out, starting with 70, you'll get 3 million. You get 3 million for the last generation, not counting the people who are still alive from the previous generations, which would really be bigger. Now, I don't know how realistic this is. Is 30 years really? I'm taking 30 because a woman's reproductive period of time is usually from 20 to 40, roughly. And some will be older, some will be younger, so on and so on. But 5.5 is not a gigantic thing. Now, so you'll tell me, oh, but Rabbi, you said to us 6 times already that in the 9th plague, 80% of the Jews died. So it's 15 million. 15 million. Does that break the bank? Well, if you use 7, you'll get more than 15 million. Because when you have something to the 7th power, it multiplies a lot. So I don't think you have to think here of spectacular, earth-shattering miracles that made it happen. The Medrash says, but not because it's worried about numbers. Where is it coming from? How are we going to get there? The Medrash says it happened. Maybe it happened at some localized period of time. Not every time. Not everyone had that happen. But so that's something which you should know, that it's certainly not normal. Usually children die, and some people are not fertile, and so forth and so on. Okay, I hear that. But it's not what you imagine, that each woman would have to have 600 children. It's just not true. Yeah.
Given the measures, wouldn't the problem actually be the reverse of them? The population would be too small given the amount of children that they're having, no?
It doesn't say it happened every time with every woman in every generation. It just says it happened. Could happen in, just in 1 year. You don't have to go any further. That's what I meant when I mentioned that. Okay, people ask these questions. And then, by the way, so then the promises, how numerous are Jacob's children going to be, or Abraham's children going to be? Like the stars in the heavens, like the sand of the seashore, like the like the earth, the soil. Rabbi, today the current estimate of how many stars there are is 10 to the 22. Until next year, we'll have a different estimate. You really think that it could be that many children, that many descendants? After all, the earth wouldn't hold them, and so on and so on. But there are verses that say that it did happen. Not only that it will happen sometime in the future, here it says that that's how many they had in Egypt. So whatever you think, like the stars for multitude means, it doesn't mean counting every star that we count in the sky. It means something else. Whatever it means, and Moses says the same thing to the Jews who come out of Egypt. God has made you like the stars of the heavens for multitude. Okay, so whatever it is, it happened. And it says when King Solomon gathered the people to inaugurate the temple, it also says like the stars of the heavens. So it's not a big deal. There became a nation, Goy. The word Goy, there's a word Gvi'ah. Gvi'ah means a body. A body has contours that's separated from everything else. That's the definition of a body. So here the word Goy indicates something which has its own contours. It has its own boundaries, which means it has its own identity. So you have a population, but somehow they became a distinguished population there. Now we're going to see that this has to be taken carefully because there was a deterioration of their culture to the extent that the angels accused them of worshiping idols. But okay, we'll come to that. Now it says a nation, Gadol v'atzum. So Gadol means big. It's often translated as great. The word great in English also means big. The greatcoat was the coat you wore over all your other clothes. Great is a kind of use of bigness. And then we use it to describe things that are outstanding, like he's a big scholar, or a big football player, or a big star in the media, and so forth and so on. So here it means distinguished and had a certain greatness about it, and atzum means extremely powerful. How do they translate? Great, mighty, right? And he quotes a verse that says exactly that. Children of Israel were fruitful, increased abundantly, and multiplied, became very, very mighty, and the land was filled with them. And here's the description which the Metziv pointed out. What do you mean the land was filled with them? I thought they were living in Goshen. Well, they used to be living in Goshen, but after the original sons of Jacob died, as we said the other day, they gave up circumcision, and they gave up their geographical isolation, and that's when the deterioration started to take place. Va-rav, and numerous. Rav really means a lot. It can be numerous. It can be a great quantity of stuff. It doesn't have to be a count noun. It can be a substance noun. It just means lots. So he quotes a verse now from Yechezkel. I made you thrive like the plants of the field. This is a historical statement about Jews in previous generations. And you grew big and tall, and you came to be of great charm, beautiful of form. Your hair was grown long, but you were naked and bare. When they write beautiful of form, in the Hebrew it's your breasts were grown. But you were naked and bare. What does that refer to? And I passed over you, and I saw you downtrodden, wallowing in your blood. And I said, through your blood you shall live. And I said, through your blood you shall live. This is quite mysterious. What's talking about in Yechezkel? What does it mean? Through your blood you shall live. So here the oral tradition tells us that this description is a description of the Jewish people in Egypt. That's why it's brought here to explain their condition in Egypt, which is what we're talking about. Now, you grew to be of beautiful form, newly mature, with great capabilities, but with no mitzvos. So those capabilities weren't accomplishing anything. Like being physically developed with no clothing. Nothing to use it to express an identity, a position. Oh, but I told you that you should live through your blood. And it says it twice. What does that mean? Well, what did God tell the Jewish people to do in Egypt when they didn't have mitzvos? He told them the day before the Exodus, the 14th of Nisan, circumcise yourselves and offer the Paschal sacrifice, blood and blood. And that's how you'll live. Before you have the Torah as a whole, these mitzvos will enable you to live. Now, it's very interesting that these mitzvos have a very specific distinction. There is a penalty for failure to perform a mitzvah or for violating a mitzvah called kares. Kares means being cut off from God. Maybe we'll elaborate on that on a later date. It's a very serious penalty. All of the commandments whose violation carry the penalty of kares are negatives. Don't do X. Except for two. And that's these two. Circumcision and the Paschal sacrifice. These are positive commandments, and if a person omits either of them, then he suffers the penalty of kares. So something's very, very special about these mitzvahs. And when you talk about the Paschal sacrifice, you have to be very careful because there are at least two different mitzvahs in the Paschal sacrifice. One is offering it, and the other is eating it. On only one of them, if omitted, carries the penalty of kares. Which one would that be, do you think? Would it be the offering of the sacrifice or the eating of the sacrifice? Well, it's the offering. It's the offering of the sacrifice. Someone who offers the sacrifice and then chooses not to eat it does not suffer kares. Someone who doesn't offer it but chooses to eat it, which he shouldn't do anyway, does suffer kares. The kares comes on the offering, not on the eating. Why would these two mitzvos be the only ones whose omission would cause kares? One simple answer is, these are the two mitzvos that qualified us for the Exodus. These are the two mitzvos that gave us the sign of blood that we are the ones who are going to be separated out from the Egyptians and taken into the wilderness and taken to Mount Sinai and receive the Torah. So these two mitzvos stamped our identity. And that's why, if you missed one of them, you don't have that identity. And you're cut off. That's one simple explanation. There are many other explanations, but that's what's going on here. So that's, we said, with this blood you shall live. You'll live because a Jew who's not a Jew who's not functioning as a Jew, is not alive. That's not called life. That's what I would call the drasha on this pasuk in Yechezkel, this verse from Ezekiel. That's the first verse. Yeah.
So, is it that your kara is specifically in the case where you don't offer it and you eat it, or your kara is just for having not offered it?
The eating is irrelevant. Just not offering it already makes you subject to courage.
So if you're someone who is a secular Jew and you spend years like essentially not participating in it, not understanding this, having just this second learned this specific halacha, what's your situation?
Okay, the answer is that courage only applies to a person who knowingly and willingly violates the mitzvah.
So from now on.
It means, right, what you didn't ask about that. You asked about people who are a secular Jew, doesn't know, doesn't ever do it. Doesn't apply to him because you can't give him any punishment if he doesn't know what he's doing. Okay, next verse. The Egyptians, if you want the strict literal translation of the word is, the Egyptians eviled us. Now think, the beautiful ambiguity there, right? They eviled us. And oppressed, it's not too bad, and they put upon us difficult labor. Just playing with the word. Eviled us could mean two things. It could mean, as your translator writes, and I think all the translators write, they ill-treated us. They treated us evilly. But to evil might be a transitive verb, which would mean to make us evil. That's another way to read it linguistically. And some commentators say, how did they have the power, the ability to treat us ill? Only by first eviling us. Only by first influencing us to give up what distinguishes us. That's exactly what the Netziv said. Had we stayed in Goshen and had we practiced bris milah, it never would have happened. But they influenced us to give up what distinguishes us. And that gave them the power to treat us evilly. And both meanings are present and both meanings are applied. Okay, now comes a trick verse. They ill-treated us, or however you want to translate it, as it is said. Watch. Come, let us deal cunningly with them. This is Pharaoh speaking to his people about the Jews. Lest they multiply. And if we should happen to have war, they will join our enemies and fight against us and go out of the country. Let's think about this. How are we going to manage this? Because this might happen. How can we protect ourselves against this terrible consequence? And the result of it was creating the slavery to hold on to them, right? Okay. Now, if you've been listening and you're still awake, I know it's 7 o'clock in the evening, but it's only 10 to 7. Maybe you should be awake. Why does he anticipate that if there'll be a war, the Jews will join the enemy? Why is he anticipating that? What in the Jews' condition would lead them to join the enemy? Why should they do that? Yeah.
Maybe what he's trying to do is, since the Jews are pretty much trying to assimilate with the Egyptians, he's seeing that they would try to do something similar to what the Egyptians would do if they were considered themselves like separate from them. So like what other like Goy would do to them if they were like as like numerous, but like kind of like part of a making, kind of like similar to what like Laban was kind of sort of doing.
I'm also. My question was, he specifically is worried about the possibility that if there'll be war, the Jews will join the enemy and make war against the Egyptians. That's what he says he's worried about. What in the situation leads him to worry about that? What is there in the Jews' condition or behavior which would lead him to think they're really not loyal, they're really a fifth column, they're really looking for an opportunity to overthrow the government and so on and so on? Where do we have that?
The concern maybe that they'll join a different nation and that will wage war against the Egyptians? They assimilate.
What did we just read? You have the text in front of you? If there'll be a war, they will join our enemies in battle. Doesn't mean they'll go and take out citizenship papers in the other country. It means the other nation will be battling against us, and then the Jews will also battle against us, and we'll be in trouble. Well, okay, I hope it's clear. The answer that, listen, they're slaves. They're being mistreated. They hate their masters, and they want a rebellion for their freedom, right? How's that for an answer?
Doesn't work.
Why doesn't it work?
Because they're not slaves yet.
They're not slaves yet. Hello. This was the introduction to the strategy to make them into slaves. So that can't be the right answer. Yeah.
They're a distinct people. They circumcise themselves. They set themselves apart. If it ever came that an enemy attacked and was winning, they can just switch over to the other side because they're not really part of the nation of Egypt. They mark themselves aside.
So the question is, at what point in time does this happen? This happens, but after what it says before that the land was filled with them, then they stopped doing circumcision, and they've come to dwell side by side. And listen to the end of the verse. Let's see. I'm worried about the Jews' loyalty. They might join our enemies, and then they'll leave the country. Why would he suspect they're going to leave the country? Who's stopping them now from leaving the country? Nobody's enslaved them yet. They're free citizens. They're not leaving now. Why would you assume that later they want to leave? So here, the oral tradition says you have a style, a biblical style, where when you express something which would be a disaster for yourself, you don't say it about yourself. You say it about the other guy. But you really mean yourself. We use that style also. We talk about what will happen if XYZ takes place. What will happen to Sonehem Shel Israel, those who hate the Jewish people. What we really mean is the Jewish people. We just don't say it. We don't say it that way. Here he means, V'alinu in ha'aretz mi'bar alei. What he really meant to say is, they'll chase us out of the land. If they're really disloyal, if they're looking to join our enemies, if the enemies win the war, the Jews will take over. They're not going to leave Egypt with the Nile, the breadbasket of the Middle East. Why would they leave? They'll take over. They'll chase the Egyptians out. That's what he meant to say, but he didn't say it explicitly. It's a very tricky verse. Very tricky verse. But this is the verse that introduces the when it says that they oppressed us, this was the beginning of the oppression. Right? This strategy. Now, vaya'anunu, they oppressed us. Look at this. They have placed taskmasters over them to oppress them with their impositions, burdens, and they built storehouses for Pharaoh, Pithom and Ramses. So first of all, you sometimes hear people say, "Oh, Rabbi, I know what it says in your book. It says that the Jews built the pyramids." But that's nonsense. They certainly didn't. Your book is just wrong. Well, it says here specifically storehouses, the store cities. The pyramids were not store cities. They were burials for the upper-ups with the materials they needed. It was not places to store grain and store livestock and the rest, meat and so on and so on. But look at the verse and tell me, what was the purpose of this oppression? What was the Egyptian purpose of the oppression? Maybe I didn't ask you. What was the purpose of the exercise? What were they trying to accomplish by making them slaves?
Seems that the objective is to oppress them.
Yes, the objective is to oppress them, not to get free labor to build cities. No, it's quite clear. Leman anoso b'sivlosam, in order to oppress them with their burdens. The goal here was to conquer their spirit. The goal was to conquer their spirit. Productivity, yes. Productivity, no. And here, when you compare this with the Nazis, Machshavim, they also had schemes whereby they wanted to break the spirit of Jews. They would starve them and then throw food in among them and watch them fight over the food and say, look at them, they're like animals. They starved them. Who's the animals there? They're the animals. But Pharaoh, according to our tradition, did them one better, because it says that Pharaoh had men do women's work and women do men's work. Because even if you're a slave, if you are working at something at which you are skilled and your performance is high class, there's a certain satisfaction you have even though you're doing it for your slave master. And I have this from a wonderful book called To Vanquish the Dragon, which is a book about a group of Beis Yaakov girls in the Holocaust. They were in a labor camp, and you had to work 7 days a week, of course. One of the girls was a seamstress, so they were sewing, I guess, uniforms for the German army or whatever it was. And she was so good, in the time that they allotted, she was managed to sew extra garments and hide them, so that on Shabbos she pretended to be working. And when the supervisor came by and said, where's the garment that you sewed now? She would take out the garment which she had sewed on Friday or Thursday or Wednesday and say, here's the one I just finished. And that way she was able not to work on Shabbos. And she says, my garments were good. I'm a good seamstress. They were good. They were well done. They were well made. So she had a certain pride of her efforts, even though she's doing them for the slave master. Pharaoh said, no, I don't want them to have that. I want them to be clumsy. I want them to be inefficient. I want the product to be something that's not respectable. I don't want them to even have that satisfaction. Pharaoh was a better psychologist than the Germans, or the Germans just wanted some of the free labor in addition to oppression. But that's how subtle the oppression was. Okay, now, I skipped here. And they laid heavy labors upon us. As it is said, the Egyptians made the children of Israel slave rigorously. Now I'm going to test you. Well, it's not fair to test you. You don't have enough education, but you'll learn this, and the recording is a test for people. I'm going to tell you a vort, a Jewish idea, and you tell me where it comes from. What strand of our traditional literature produced the following idea? The Hebrew word that describes how they made the work is forech, pei, resh, chaf. Now, that word contains a hidden reference, and to unpack it, you need 2 steps of decoding. First of all, we have a code called the Atbash code, where you associate letters, the first and last letter, the second and next to last letter. That's called Atbash. Aleph, Tov, Beis, Shin, Gimel, Resh. You associate the letters that way, and then when you have a word, you trade the letter for the Atbash letter. That's the first step. So, Pei is 6 from the end of the Aleph base, and therefore it's traded for a Vav. Resh is 3 from the end, so it's traded for a Gimel. And Chaf is 12 from the end. So So then that's over the middle, because it's 22. So then you got to go to 12 from the other side, which is Lamed, and it's Lamed. So you have Vav, Gimel, Lamed. Those are the 3 traded letters. That's step 1. Step 2, take the gematria, the numerical value of those letters. Okay, Vav is 6, and Gimel is 3, is 9, and Lamed is 30, is 39. These are the 39 categories of physical, creative effort that are forbidden on Shabbos. And it's to teach you that the Egyptians caused the Jewish people to go through all 39 categories of those efforts, 39 categories of labor. So you start with the Hebrew word, you do the Atbash trading, and then you take the numerical value, And you get 39, and those are the 39 categories. Where is that found? So when I ask this of people who have black hats and who don't know the answer, they'll tell me, oh, it's found in some Kabbalistic source. Or it's found in some Hasidic source. You know, maybe the Balaturim al Torah who does numbers and so on and so on. That's where it's got to be found. Okay, boys and girls, I'm glad you're sitting down. It's Tosfos. Tosfos and Arvei Pesachim. There's nothing more normative than Tosfos. There's nothing more nigla than Tosfos. Tosfos writes it, and that should give you a point to remember when you're classifying Jewish literature and characterizing its content and setting up hierarchies and so on and so on, that Tosfos was on the top of the pile, felt it appropriate to do that. Now, the idea is that you have the 39 categories for Shabbos. All 39 were used in constructing the tabernacle. And the Tosfos is saying they were used for work in Egypt. That means, to tell you two things. First of all, this is all physically creative efforts that can be used for the greatest or for the lowest. Physically creative efforts are ambiguous. And then Shabbos is above all physical efforts. So there's a lot in there to meditate on. Okay, yeah.
So just to understand it, if they wanted to just destroy the Jewish people, they could have done so. They were more numerous, they could have killed them throughout the land. If they wanted to just exploit them, there would be many better ways to go about doing it. So they specifically are doing this to evil them, right? So they want to destroy the Jewish people, but they need to corrupt them first. Is that the strategy that they have to take?
Not quite. If you go back to, page 111, the Egyptians ill-treated us. What is it that was motivating them? Come, let us deal cunningly with them, lest they multiply. Lest they multiply. If they're oppressed with work, and they have no pride in their work, and they're being treated like dirt, and they come to feel themselves to be like dirt, they feel themselves to be worthless, they're not going to have children. They're not going to have children. And indeed, the oral tradition tells us that there was a different response between the men and the women. Just had this last week in a certain Rashi on a certain pasuk. And the men said, we can't bring children into a world like this. There's absolutely no meaning to our existence. Let's give it up. Amram divorced Yocheved, who were the parents of Aaron and Miriam. Moses was not yet born. And all the men divorced their women, following their example, because there's no point to an existence like this. So the Gemara quotes an argument that Miriam had against her father, but it also quotes that the women influenced their husbands to provide for another generation. And this is how they did it. Remember, the women were enslaved also. But at the end of a day, they would take two pots, the women, one pot with little fish, another pot with water, and they would go out to the fields where their husbands were, and they would use one pot of water to wash their husbands' bodies, the other, the fish and some water in it, they would put on a fire, and they would cook the fish, they would eat, and then the woman would say to the husband, am I not more beautiful than you are? Am I not more beautiful than you are? And with that, they would encourage the fathers to father the next generation. What interesting words. I'm more beautiful than you are. Meaning, you've given up hope. I haven't. I haven't. You can't deny me. I'll take responsibility. And because of that, say Chazal, b'schus noshim tzadkonios nigalu avoseinim b'Mitzrayim. The merit of the righteous women, our fathers were redeemed from Egypt, because without the righteous women, there wouldn't have been any fathers to redeem. It's an astonishing thing. It's an astonishing thing. Now, last week we had last Shabbos, today's Monday, 2 days ago, we had the reading of the construction of the Mishkan. And one of the items there is the kior, the container of water out of which the Kohanim washed their hands and feet when they went to do service in the temple, in the tabernacle. It says, it was made out of the mirrors of the women who gathered together to donate them to the Mishkan, to the tabernacle. So Rashi says, which mirrors were those? Those were the mirrors. It says when they took the two pots, the one with water and the one with fish, out to the fields. I forgot to say this, and they would wash their husbands' bodies, and then they would eat the fish, and then they would sit together, and the women would hold up the mirror and say, "Look at our reflections in the mirror. Am I not more beautiful than you are?" Those mirrors that they used to encourage the husbands, those mirrors they gave to the tabernacle. Those mirrors became the way in which Kohanim purify themselves before they go and do the avodah. So it's an astonishing picture. Think of what those mirrors were used for. And I must tell you that only this year, because my Rebbetzin is going through the Even Ezra this year, and she saw what the Even Ezra says, and I tried to put it together with what Rashi brings from Chazal, I came to a better understanding of it. You think here, well, those mirrors were used to preserve the Jewish people through encouraging the men to have relations with their wives so as to father the next generation. So they're very holy. Even Ezra something entirely different. He says these women were so detached from the physical world that they didn't need them. These women were very holy. And holiness to him means being detached from the physical world. And that's why it was appreciated. That's why it was appreciated. So first, when she told me that, we talked about it together, I thought, so Even Ezra is saying something quite different from what Chazal is saying. Chazal is saying they elevated the physical by encouraging their husbands to have relations, and he's saying that they are divorced from the physical. But then, after discussing it, I think it comes out that it's not so far at all. Because these mirrors that they used to encourage their husbands, these mirrors they're giving up. So the fact that it's accepted is because they're giving them up. No one's had a tax and said, take the copper mirrors because they're good for the kior. So there's no question that what's being appreciated here is they're cutting themselves off from them, giving them up and not having them anymore. But then, if I look at through the eyes of the Even Ezra, it comes out like this. Their attitude towards the physical is like the Mesilas Yesharim talks about Tahara. As little interaction with the physical as possible, but of course there are times. There are times. And it was a question of, shall there be another generation of Jews or shall there not be another generation of Jews? Then for sure, you use the physical, you use the copper mirrors to encourage the husbands to have relations, to have children. No question about it. But that's it. The physical is used only to elevate it to the spiritual and to the holy. And then they take a look at these mirrors and say, okay, now we're out of Egypt and we're building the Mishkan. We're not going to be slaves anymore. And there's not going to be any worry that the Jewish people aren't going to exist anymore. There's nothing left to do with the mirrors. These mirrors that we used for that purpose, nothing left to do with them. That's why we give them up. That's what the Even Ezra is saying. So I think you could meld the Even Ezra together with what Chazal say, pretty much. It's 100%, but it's giving you a much better insight into the way it's happening. Okay, now the next pasuk, which has also great messages. We cried out to Hashem, the God of our fathers, and He heard our voice and saw our oppression and our burden, we'll talk about that, and our lachatz, which is pressure. These are words for terrible pressure and suffering. So the Haggadah will explain each one. We cried out to Hashem, the God of our fathers, as it says. It came to pass during that long period that the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel groaned because of the bondage. And they cried. And their prayers rose up to God because of the servitude, because of the slavery that they were suffering under. Now, let's see if you know any current history, current world politics. What does it mean that the king of Egypt died and they cried? What's that? What's that? There is a country in the world which illustrates this in spades.
What's your exact question? I'm confused now. Your question?
What is a relationship? You know, the verse, when it describes something, it says A, B, and C. That means they're related to one another. A is the cause of B, or A and B cause C, or C explains A and B. There's some connection. And it says, well, they cried when the king of Egypt died. Well, leave that out. How do I care whether he died or not? They cried and Hashem heard them. That's the important thing.
So why say they cried over the king of Egypt's death?
Well, it doesn't say that. It just says the king of Egypt died and they cried, right? But now I'm telling you that these things are not just a list of items. You know, go to the store and buy peas and shoelaces, and right? So it's got to be a relationship.
So it would be that then that they cried. It seems to be that the relationship is that when the king of Egypt died, they cried because of that.
Yeah. Now, how do you touch up the because? How do you explain the because? They were mourning for the king of Egypt?
I mean, maybe he treated them well, and now if there's a new king, he's not going to treat them well.
No. We saw as motivation. Motivation was to oppress them. No. Which country in the contemporary world does this refer to? You know, say what you want to say.
Well, no, I was pretty much just going to say that maybe like the king, at least the king that they saw beforehand, I guess, died in their eyes, and now it's just kind of like this king that's now oppressing them.
Have you heard of North Korea?
I was going to say that. But I was like, I don't...
Everybody's happy in North Korea. They're all smiling all the time. They're all joyful all the time. And that's until the president dies. Then you can cry. You can cry because it's a sad event for the kingdom. Otherwise, everybody's happy. That is to say, you better put on a happy face or you're dead. Right? The only excuse they had to cry was because the king died. They couldn't cry before. They couldn't cry before. Everybody else in Egypt was crying because of the king. And they're crying. Who says why they're crying? Maybe they're crying why the Egyptians are crying. Who knows? Then they could cry. It's the bitterness is right there, you know. Just have to look. That's the relationship between the yeah.
Can you also take like a Stalin approach? Like even though it's horrific, you can learn to love your oppression, like perversely.
No.
Why?
No. The what it's called, the Copenhagen effect with the kidnappers. Stockholm effect. Yeah. Okay. We still have time. Okay. Now. Okay, because of the servitude, let's keep going for the moment. Hashem heard our voice. As it is said, God heard their moaning, and God recalled his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now that's really, really interesting. Well, let's go on, and I'll come back to it. He saw ill treatment. It refers to the breaking of the family life. God looked upon the children of Israel, and he took note. Our burden refers to children. All the newborns you shall cast into the river, and our oppression, pressure. I've also seen the oppression, right? Gee, the crying is because of the servitude. What is this intervening verse? He heard our voice. It says he heard the moaning, and he recalled his covenant. Why is that there? The Gaon of Vilna has to me, an astonishing explanation here. Why did God take us out of Egypt? Because over and over again, he remembered the covenant with the patriarchs. We read it, what he said to Abraham. They'll be there for 100 years, and I'll take them out. I'll go out with great riches. Remember the when Moses at the burning bush, and God says he goes down to Egypt, you'll take the Jews out. God, and Moses says, what did they do to deserve being taken out? And God says, when they come out, they'll receive the Torah where you are now. Meaning, what did they do in Egypt to deserve it? Nothing. Nothing. It's an investment in their future, not a response to their past. There's also the covenant with the patriarchs. Okay, but what's the connection between their crying out and praying to God on the one hand and the covenant with the patriarchs? Well, let's see. I've told you now 7 times that in the 9th plague, 80% of the Jews died. What about the covenant to the patriarchs? And I mentioned once or twice that after the golden calf, God says to Moses, I've had it with them, they're unworthy, I'm going to kill them all out, and I'll make a new nation out of you. Just you. And with the sin of the spies, the same thing. I've had it, I'll kill them all out, I'll make a new nation out of you. What exactly does the covenant with the patriarchs cover? What does it guarantee? Didn't guarantee the 80% in Egypt who died. Didn't guarantee the population that left Egypt. They could all have died. And God says to Moses, oh, the covenant? You'll be the source. There'll be a bottleneck in the population, then it'll be replaced from you. The covenant is not a guarantee to a particular individual or to a particular group. Rather, the group has to be an expression of the covenant. Then the covenant could apply to them. So says the Gaon of Vilna, God increased the oppression of the Jewish people to the point where they couldn't help but calling out to God. And once they called out to God, they became relevant to the covenant with the patriarchs, and then the covenant of the patriarchs could be the motivation for saving them. Otherwise, it wouldn't have applied. This was God's kindness he did to them. The oppression should be increased to the point where they call out in desperation so that they'll be connected to the covenant so that they can be saved. And that's why this verse is in the middle here. They called out and their cry was up to God because of the servitude, and God remembered the covenant. And saw the affliction, and saw the separation of family life and the children thrown into the water. Yes, he saw all of that, but first, he remembered the covenant, because that was the purpose of it. The purpose of it was to remember the covenant, and then their suffering could be relevant to taking them out. Without that, it wouldn't have been relevant. And this is a good example of how you can be looking at something and watching it and observing it with all of the wise of the world, and the Economist and the New York Times, these clever people, and not understand it at all. Not understand it at all. That the increase in the servitude and the pain and the suffering was the way in which they were going to be saved. Just like in Megillah Esther, that when Haman cast a lot and frightened the Jews into doing tshuva, that's how they were saved. Certainly didn't understand that either. It's a very good example of how history operates on dimensions that we're often not aware of. Okay, pick it up tomorrow, Mr. Shem.